An 8-year-old boy, Ethan, holds a secret that could shatter his father's happiness. On the day of what should be a joyous wedding, Ethan finds himself facing a terrible choice: remain silent or reveal the sinister truth about his father's fiancée. As vows are moments away, Ethan steps forward, uncovering shocking secrets that send the entire chapel into chaos. With betrayal, hidden motives, and a desperate plot twist, this tale of courage proves that even the smallest voices can change lives. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the pews in the small chapel. Family and friends whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the doors with expectant smiles. The air was thick with anticipation. At the altar, David Matthews stood tall in a crisp black tuxedo, shifting slightly as he waited for his bride. A warm but nervous smile tugged at his lips. Today was meant to be the start of his new life, a life he could finally share with someone he loved. Next to David stood his 8-year-old son, Ethan, fidgeting with the small pillow he held in his hands. His miniature suit matched his father's perfectly, and his dark curls were combed neatly, giving him an angelic look. But his expression was far from serene. As he held the ring pillow with tightly clenched fists, Ethan's eyes weren't on the door like everyone else's. They were on his father, who looked happier than he had in years. It hurt, Ethan realized, to know that he might be the only one who wasn't excited today. David leaned down, sensing his son's nervousness. "You look great, buddy," he whispered, giving Ethan's shoulder a comforting squeeze. Best ring bearer a dad could ask for. Ethan managed a smile, his brown eyes clouded with worry, but he nodded, wanting to be strong for his father. He wished he could explain the terrible feeling that had taken root in his chest, but he doubted his dad would understand. Not today. Not with the beautiful Emily about to walk down the aisle and fulfill his father's dream of having a loving family again. A sudden hush fell over the congregation, and the first notes of the wedding march filled the chapel. The crowd rose, craning their necks to catch the first glimpse of Emily, and the chapel doors opened wide. She stood there, framed by sunlight, in a gown of white lace and silk that flowed around her like a delicate mist. Her golden hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her smile was soft and inviting as she began her graceful walk down the aisle. Ethan didn't look at her. He couldn't. His gaze stayed on his father, his hands clutching the pillow so tightly his knuckles turned white. A sense of urgency pulsed through him, almost drowning out the music. All around him, people beamed and wiped away happy tears. But for Ethan, each passing moment felt like a countdown. "Isn't she beautiful?" someone whispered behind him. "Yes, they're so lucky to have found each other," replied another voice, awash with emotion. "Lucky." The word rang hollow in Ethan's mind. For weeks, he had felt something was off about Emily, though he hadn't wanted to admit it, especially since his father seemed so happy. At first, he tried to be friendly, hoping that maybe things would work out. After all, he knew how much his father missed his mom, who had passed away 2 years ago. But as the months wore on, Ethan's hope had slowly transformed into something else. A gnawing fear that grew stronger each time he was left alone with her. As the officiant began speaking, Ethan's mind drifted to the first time he'd met Emily. His father had picked him up from school on a crisp autumn afternoon, practically bouncing with excitement. "I've got someone special I want you to meet, buddy," David had said, his smile wide and hopeful. Ethan remembered how his stomach had twisted, a mix of curiosity and worry, as they drove home. Since his mother's passing, it had been just him and his dad, and he wasn't sure how he felt about a new person entering their lives. Emily had been waiting on their porch, her golden hair catching the late afternoon sun. She had knelt down to Ethan's level and smiled warmly. "It's so nice to meet you, Ethan. Your dad talks about you all the time," she had said, her blue eyes twinkling. Ethan had felt a flicker of hope then, imagining that maybe she would bring some joy back into their lives. But soon, cracks began to appear. At first it was subtle, cold looks, dismissive tones, only when his father wasn't around. One evening, when David was working late, Ethan had tried to talk to her about his school project on the solar system. "Do you like space, Miss Emily?" he'd asked tentatively. But instead of engaging, she had sighed, not looking up from her phone. "Eat your dinner quietly, please," she had said in a clipped tone, not sparing him a single glance. Moments like that had become all too common. When David was around, Emily would laugh at Ethan's jokes, ask about his day, and play the part of a caring soon-to-be stepmother. But when they were alone, her warmth vanished, replaced by cold, dismissive words that made Ethan feel like he was a burden. Each cruel remark chipped away at him, and soon he had begun to feel isolated, spending more and more time in his room, avoiding the common spaces of his own home. Ethan's hands began to tremble slightly as he clutched the ring pillow, his heart racing with the memories. He tried to push them away, to focus on the present, but something inside him wouldn't let him ignore the warning signs any longer. Emily had become an almost constant source of worry, and as much as he wanted to believe his dad's happiness could last, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a dangerous illusion. "Do you, David, take Emily to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The officiant's voice rang out, filling the chapel. David turned to Emily, his eyes shining with love, and began to speak the vows that would bind them together forever. In that moment, Ethan felt a surge of panic, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His father didn't know the truth, and no one else would believe it. Ethan had tried to tell him about her harsh words and secret phone calls, but David had laughed it off, thinking Ethan was just struggling to accept the change. Ethan's gaze moved to Emily, who was smiling sweetly at his father, but he saw through the mask. He could see the cold, calculating look that she hid so well from everyone else. And that was when he knew he couldn't let the ceremony go on. He had to do something, anything, to stop it, no matter what anyone else thought. The officiant's words were drowned out by Ethan's heart pounding in his chest. The officiant's words faded into the background as Ethan's mind spiraled back to the day Emily first stepped into his life. He had been unsure then, hesitant about a new person joining their family. But he wanted his father to be happy, so he had tried his best to be open-minded. It hadn't been easy, especially given the memories of his mother that lingered in every corner of their house, but he figured that if his dad was happy, then maybe he could be too. Ethan had tried to give Emily a fair chance, but that goodwill had slowly crumbled. When David wasn't around, Emily seemed like a completely different person. Her warmth turned to ice, and the affectionate smiles she showed his father disappeared. She would scold him for minor mistakes, like leaving a toy on the floor or not finishing his vegetables. Every small misstep seemed to elicit a critical word or a cold look. Ethan started to feel like an outsider in his own home, his once comfortable surroundings now tinged with the uncomfortable tension that lingered whenever he was alone with her. One memory stood out vividly. His father had been working late one evening, leaving him alone with Emily. They were seated at the dinner table, Ethan trying to engage her in conversation as he picked at his food. "Miss Emily, do you like animals?" he had asked, hoping to spark some sort of connection. Emily had merely looked up from her phone, sighed, and said, "Eat your dinner, Ethan. I don't have time for your chatter." Her voice was flat, dismissive, and it stung. That night, Ethan had gone to bed feeling more alone than ever, clutching his stuffed dog, a gift from his mom years ago, as he tried to understand why Emily seemed to dislike him so much. Whenever his father returned, though, Emily transformed. She would laugh at his jokes, ask him about school, and act every bit the loving future stepmother. It was confusing, like watching someone play a role just for the sake of an audience. Ethan had tried to tell his father about her behavior, but David, caught up in his new relationship, always brushed it off. "She's probably just adjusting, buddy. Give her some time," he'd say with a reassuring smile. But time only made things worse. As the weeks passed, Ethan started to notice the subtle but constant put-downs from Emily when his father wasn't around. Little comments about his messy room or how he was too much of a handful. Each remark chipped away at his self-confidence, making him feel like he was a burden rather than a cherished part of the family. One Saturday morning, Ethan was excited to show Emily a project he had worked on in school, a solar system diorama he had put hours into. When he proudly presented it to her, hoping for even a small word of praise, she barely glanced at it. "It's nice, Ethan, but there's always room for improvement," she had said dismissively, not even looking up from her phone. He had walked away that day feeling as though he couldn't do anything right. Ethan began withdrawing more and more, hiding out in his room with his books and his memories of his mother. When David would ask him if everything was okay, Ethan would force a smile and say he was fine. But deep down, he felt as though he was losing his father to someone who didn't really care about either of them. One evening, a few months before the wedding, an incident occurred that changed everything. David had gone out to run some errands, leaving Ethan and Emily alone in the house. Ethan was in the living room watching cartoons, relaxing with a glass of juice. Emily entered the room, her face twisted in annoyance. "Turn that off," she snapped, gesturing toward the TV. "It's too loud. I'm trying to work." Startled, Ethan fumbled with the remote, trying to turn the volume down quickly. In his haste, he knocked over his glass, spilling juice onto the coffee table and carpet. "I'm sorry," he cried, jumping up to grab napkins, but before he could even begin to clean it, Emily was beside him, her fingers digging painfully into his arm as she yanked him away from the mess. "Look what you've done," she hissed, her face inches from his, her eyes blazing with anger. "You clumsy, careless boy, do you know how much that carpet cost?" Ethan winced, tears springing to his eyes as he stammered an apology. He felt the sting of her grip, and his heart pounded with fear. He had never seen her this angry before. "I'm sorry," he whimpered, trying to pull away. "I'll clean it up, I promise." Her grip only tightened as she leaned down, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You'd better. And if you breathe a word of this to your father, you'll be very, very sorry. Do you understand me?" Ethan nodded frantically, his heart racing as he struggled to hold back tears. As soon as Emily released him, he scrambled to clean up the spill, his hands shaking. That night, he lay awake in bed, his arm still throbbing from where she had grabbed him, replaying the incident in his mind. He wanted to tell his father about what had happened, but the fear of Emily's threat loomed over him, silencing him. The following morning, when David returned home, Emily greeted him with a cheerful smile and a kiss, acting as though nothing had happened. Ethan watched from the stairs, his arm hidden behind his back, rubbing the sore spot where her fingers had dug into his skin. In that moment, he felt more alone than ever, trapped in a reality that no one else could see or understand. As the wedding day drew nearer, Ethan became increasingly desperate. He wanted to tell his father about Emily's true nature, but each attempt was thwarted by his own fear and his father's unwavering trust in her. David would smile and talk about how wonderful it would be to have Emily as part of their family, and Ethan would nod along, not wanting to burst his father's bubble of happiness. One evening, Ethan finally mustered the courage to approach his father. David was in his study, going over some paperwork, when Ethan timidly knocked on the door. "Come in, buddy," David called, smiling as Ethan entered. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, twisting the hem of his shirt nervously. "Dad," he began slowly, "can I talk to you about something? It's about Emily." David set his papers aside, giving Ethan his full attention. "Of course, son, you can talk to me about anything. What's bothering you?" Taking a deep breath, Ethan tried to put his feelings into words. I don't think she likes me very much," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. David's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, buddy? Emily adores you." "No, Dad," Ethan insisted, his words coming out in a rush. "She's different when you're not around. She ignores me, and sometimes she says mean things." David sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking both concerned and slightly exasperated. "Ethan, I know this is a big change for you, and it's normal to feel a bit uncertain. But I promise, Emily cares about you. She's trying her best, just like we all are." Ethan felt his heart sink as his father's words washed over him. He wanted to believe him, to trust that everything would be okay. But deep down, he knew the truth. Emily wasn't who she pretended to be, and somehow he would have to make his father see that before it was too late. Ethan felt defeated after his attempt to talk to his dad. Despite the worry in David's eyes, he hadn't believed a word about Emily's behavior. Frustrated and more alone than ever, Ethan decided it was pointless to try again. He retreated further into himself, spending less time in shared spaces at home, knowing Emily would be there. When they were alone, she became bolder, almost daring him to protest. The small comments and cutting looks grew sharper, leaving him feeling as though he couldn't escape her scrutiny, even in his own house. As David's wedding day approached, Emily's grip on their lives tightened, and Ethan's worry deepened. But the worst was yet to come. It was a chilly Saturday afternoon about 3 months before the wedding when an incident occurred that would stay with Ethan for a long time. David had gone out for errands, leaving Ethan alone with Emily. He was watching cartoons in the living room, trying to escape into the brightly colored world of superheroes, when Emily's voice interrupted him. "Turn that down," she snapped, not even looking at him as she walked by. Startled, Ethan fumbled for the remote, accidentally increasing the volume instead of lowering it. Emily's face twisted with anger. "I said turn it down," she yelled, storming over to him. Her reaction was so intense that Ethan dropped the remote entirely, sending it clattering to the floor. As he reached to pick it up, his elbow brushed his juice glass, which toppled over, spilling orange liquid across the coffee table and carpet. Emily was furious. She grabbed his arm roughly, yanking him up from the floor. "Look at what you did," she hissed, her fingers digging painfully into his skin. "You're a little nuisance. You think you're so clever, don't you?" I'm sorry," Ethan stammered, his voice trembling. He tried to pull his arm away, but her grip tightened. She leaned down, her face just inches from his, her tone low and menacing. "If you breathe a word of this to your father, you'll regret it. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, heart pounding, feeling tears prick at his eyes. He hated the helplessness he felt under her cold, unyielding gaze. When she finally let go, he scrambled to clean up the juice, hands shaking as he wiped the table and blotted the carpet. That evening, when David returned home, Ethan hid in his room, unwilling to face his father or Emily, feeling like a stranger in his own home. From that day on, he stopped trying to tell his father anything about Emily. She had made it clear that any attempt to expose her would be met with consequences. But a strange sense of dread began to take hold in Ethan, and he found himself watching Emily more carefully, noticing small details he hadn't paid attention to before. He started to see the way she would plaster on a bright smile as soon as David walked in, transforming from a person filled with disdain to one brimming with charm and warmth. One evening, about a month before the wedding, he overheard her having a tense phone conversation. Ethan had been in his room reading, trying to block out his worries, when he heard Emily's voice drifting up the stairs, sharp and angry. Curiosity got the better of him, and he crept down the hallway, stopping just out of sight. "You need to listen to me," Emily hissed into the phone. "We can't rush this. Everything has to be perfect. The wedding is in 4 weeks. We stick to the plan." Ethan felt his stomach twist with fear. What plan? Who was she talking to? There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "Yes, the insurance policy. David doesn't suspect a thing." Ethan's heart raced as he clutched the banister, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. Insurance policy? David? He didn't fully understand, but he knew enough to sense something was terribly wrong. Emily's voice dropped lower, almost too quiet to hear. "Once we're married, we move on to phase 2. Everything will be set, and we'll be able to leave without a trace. No more close calls." Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding so loudly he thought she might hear it. Who was she talking to? And what did she mean by phase 2? A sick feeling settled in his stomach as he realized that whatever Emily was planning, it wasn't something his father knew about. It wasn't something good. "I don't care about the kid," Emily said, her tone dripping with irritation. "He's annoying, but he's not going to get in the way. Trust me, David would never believe anything he says." The words cut Ethan to the core. So she had been aware of his attempts to tell his father the truth all along. And worse, she was confident that David's trust in her was so deep that he would never believe his own son. It was then that Ethan realized just how dangerous Emily really was. She wasn't just someone who disliked him. She was someone who would go to any length to keep her secrets hidden. Ethan spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind reeling from everything he'd overheard. Emily was planning something that involved his father's life insurance policy. What exactly that meant, he wasn't sure, but it was clear that Emily's intentions were far from innocent. The next morning, Ethan felt exhausted but determined. He had to figure out what Emily was planning. He began watching her more closely, noting every time she stepped out of the house without an explanation or stayed on her phone in hushed tones. Little by little, pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Emily would disappear for hours on end, always coming back with flimsy excuses. She spent hours on her laptop, her expression guarded, and she kept a close eye on David's schedule, making sure he wouldn't notice her absences. She even suggested activities that seemed uncharacteristically risky for her, like skydiving or rock climbing, saying it would be exciting to try something new on their honeymoon. David, oblivious, laughed it off, charmed by her apparent sense of adventure. Ethan, on the other hand, felt a chill run down his spine every time she suggested something new. One evening, as he was walking by his father's study, he noticed Emily hurriedly closing David's laptop. She jumped when she saw him, giving a guilty smile. "Oh, Ethan," she said, her voice overly bright. "You startled me. I was just checking some RSVPs for the wedding." Ethan nodded, though he didn't believe her for a second. As soon as she left, he snuck into the study and opened the laptop. It was locked with a password, but Ethan knew his dad's birthday, and it only took a few tries before he was able to unlock it. When the screen finally opened, he quickly scanned the browser history. Most of it had been cleared, but one tab remained open, a life insurance website. Ethan felt his heart sink. It wasn't just an idea he'd overheard in a phone call. Emily was actually planning something, or that something dangerous, and it was all tied to his father's life. As Ethan closed the laptop, his mind raced. He was only 8, and he had no idea how to stop someone like Emily. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't just sit by and watch as she put her plan into action. Somehow, he would find a way to stop her, even if it meant facing his deepest fears. Ethan's suspicions had grown darker with each passing day, but he hadn't realized how deep Emily's deceit ran until he found himself alone in the house one rainy afternoon. David was at a last-minute meeting, and Emily had stepped out, saying she needed to finalize a few wedding details. With the house silent and empty, Ethan saw his chance. His heart pounded with both fear and determination as he crept into Emily's room, determined to uncover the full extent of her plan. Sitting on her desk was her sleek silver laptop. Ethan knew it was risky, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something critical was hidden in there. He tried a few obvious passwords, her birthday, the wedding date, but nothing worked. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a sticky note tucked under her keyboard. On it was a string of numbers and letters. With trembling fingers, he typed the code into the laptop. To his shock, the password worked, and the screen sprang to life. Ethan froze for a moment, staring at the open desktop, a mix of fear and exhilaration swirling in his chest. He clicked on a folder labeled Wedding and began to scroll through her files. Most of them looked innocent enough, lists of guests, caterers, and some notes about the ceremony. But then he noticed a document named Insurance Policy. Ethan opened it, scanning the first few lines, his heart sinking with every word. It was an insurance policy in his father's name, listing Emily as the sole beneficiary. But that wasn't the part that made his blood run cold. It was the payout amount, $5 million, in the event of accidental death. Ethan's stomach twisted as he realized the extent of Emily's plan. She hadn't just been pretending to care about his father, she was planning to hurt him. He didn't fully understand all the legal terms, but he knew enough to sense that Emily intended to marry his father, claim the insurance money, and disappear. His father's life was worth nothing more than a payday to her. As he continued to search, he found a folder labeled Mark. His heart raced as he clicked it open, revealing photos of a man he didn't recognize, a tall, dark-haired man with a scar above his left eyebrow. Some photos were just of him, while others showed Emily by his side, laughing and leaning close, their smiles more intimate than any she'd ever shared with David. It was clear. Emily was already in a relationship, and this Mark was part of her scheme. Suddenly, Ethan heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through him. He scrambled to close the files, his hands shaking as he clicked out of each document. Just as he was about to shut the laptop, he noticed a photo in the folder of Mark and Emily together, locked in a close embrace. He barely had time to close the laptop and hide it before he heard the front door open. "Ethan?" Emily's voice called from downstairs. Ethan's heart raced as he slid out of her room and into the hallway, his mind spinning with fear and anger. "I'm here," he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. He could hear her footsteps coming up the stairs, each one feeling like a countdown to disaster. Emily appeared in the hallway, her eyes narrowing as she spotted him. "What are you doing upstairs?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Ethan felt the weight of her stare, and he forced himself to appear casual. "Just looking for a book," he said, his voice wavering slightly. He tried not to look at her, afraid she might see through his lie. Emily's expression softened, but only slightly. She seemed to study him for a moment longer before giving him a forced smile. "Well, don't make a mess," she said, brushing past him to her room. Ethan barely managed to keep his sigh of relief silent as he walked back to his own room. That night, as he lay in bed, the full weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him. He had always felt that Emily wasn't who she pretended to be, but now he knew. She was dangerous. Worse than that, she had a partner, and they both were willing to go to terrible lengths to carry out their plan. It was all so clear to him now, the insurance policy, the way she had cut off his attempts to talk to his father, the suspicious absences. Emily and Mark were planning to make his father's death look like an accident after the wedding. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do. Telling his father seemed pointless. David was too blinded by love to believe anything against Emily. And even if he did believe him, Emily could easily twist the truth. He lay awake most of the night, his mind spinning with fear and a growing sense of responsibility. If he didn't act, his father's life would be at risk. The following days were torture. Ethan found himself watching Emily constantly. Every smile she gave his father and every sweet word she whispered seemed filled with falsehoods that only he could see. His father, oblivious to the storm brewing, carried on with the wedding preparations, occasionally pulling Ethan aside to tell him how happy he was that Emily was becoming part of their family. Each time he spoke, Ethan forced a smile, hiding the dread simmering beneath the surface. One afternoon, as he was helping his father in the garage, Ethan's gaze wandered toward the driveway. Emily's car pulled in, and she hurried inside without a glance at them. "I'm going to get a snack, Dad," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sure, buddy," David replied, engrossed in fixing the lawnmower. Ethan slipped into the house quietly, determined to learn more. As he crept upstairs, he heard Emily's voice coming from the guest room, the same room that would soon be her and David's bedroom. She was on the phone again. "Almost there, Mark," she whispered urgently. "Just a few more days and it'll all be set. We'll have the money and we'll be free. David's completely wrapped around my finger. He suspects nothing." Ethan's blood ran cold. The confirmation he needed was right there in her words. She didn't care about his father. He was nothing more than a tool to achieve her goal. "Ethan's too nosy for his own good, though," she continued. "But don't worry, I can handle him. David won't believe a word he says. It'll be over soon, and we'll never have to deal with this place again." Ethan took a shaky step back, accidentally bumping into the doorframe. The faint creak made him freeze, his heart pounding as he hoped she hadn't heard him. A heavy silence followed. Then he heard her move toward the door. "I have to go, Mark," she said abruptly. "I'll call you later." Ethan barely managed to slip down the stairs and into the kitchen before she stepped out of the room. When she finally entered the kitchen a few moments later, she looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Why are you down here?" she asked, her voice edged with an unsettling calmness. "Just getting a snack," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. She studied him for a long moment before offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, don't make a mess," she said in that falsely sweet voice. As she turned and walked away, Ethan's hands trembled. He couldn't stay silent any longer. He had to find a way to stop her, to save his father before it was too late. But how? He was just a kid, and the thought of going up against someone like Emily, someone with dark plans and an even darker heart, terrified him. But as he took a deep breath, a fierce determination settled in his chest. He couldn't let her hurt his father. No matter what it took, he would find a way to stop this wedding. In the days that followed, Ethan felt the weight of what he'd discovered pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He wanted desperately to tell his father everything. But each time he tried to work up the courage, a voice in his head warned him that David wouldn't believe him. After all, Ethan had tried once, and his father had brushed it off as a child's anxiety about change. Still, he knew he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. One evening, as they sat together at dinner, David looked over at Ethan with a warm smile. "You've been awfully quiet these days, buddy. Is everything all right?" Ethan looked down at his plate, his fingers tracing patterns in his mashed potatoes. This was his chance. He took a deep breath, summoning every bit of courage he had. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you about Emily." David's smile faltered, and he set down his fork, leaning in with a look of concern. "What is it, son?" Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to spill everything about the insurance policy, the hidden conversations, the mysterious man named Mark, but the words stuck in his throat. What if his father dismissed him again? Or worse, what if Emily found out he'd tried to warn his dad? Her threat still echoed in his mind, chilling him to the bone. She doesn't like me, Dad," Ethan whispered finally, his voice small and uncertain. David sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Ethan, I know it's been tough for you. A new person in our lives, especially after your mom. But Emily really cares about us. She wants to make a happy home with us." Ethan shook his head. "No, Dad, you don't understand. She's different when you're not around. She says mean things and acts like she doesn't want me here." David's expression softened, but there was a hint of impatience in his voice. "Look, buddy, sometimes adults get stressed, and maybe Emily hasn't been as patient as she should be, but that doesn't mean she doesn't care about you." "But Dad, Ethan's voice broke, his courage slipping away. David's eyes, filled with worry but tinged with disbelief, made him feel like he was talking to a wall. He could see the trust his father had in Emily, and Ethan knew he couldn't break through it. Not like this. David reached across the table, squeezing Ethan's hand gently. "I know this has been hard, but please, give her a chance. She's trying her best." Ethan forced a nod, though the words felt hollow. He could see that his father's love for Emily had blinded him to her true nature. David had been alone for so long that he was willing to believe in the illusion of a perfect family, even if it meant ignoring the warning signs. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring up at the ceiling. He knew he had to do something, but he was trapped. David wouldn't listen, and confronting Emily directly would only make things worse. He felt helpless, caught in a web of secrets and lies with no way out. As he tossed and turned, an idea began to form in his mind. If he couldn't get through to his father with words, maybe he could show him proof. The next morning, Ethan watched Emily carefully. He noticed that she had started spending more time on her phone, always locking the screen the moment David entered the room. Her conversations were rushed and hushed, her eyes darting around whenever she spoke. Each time David asked her who she was talking to, she'd flash him a sweet smile and say, "Oh, just the wedding planner, dear." But Ethan knew better. He noticed how she would occasionally slip away for hours, her excuses flimsy at best. One evening, she claimed she was meeting the girls for a last-minute dress fitting. David accepted it without question, but Ethan could see through the lie. He knew she wasn't meeting friends, she was meeting Mark. As the days passed, Ethan began planning. He knew that in order to expose Emily, he'd have to take risks. One night, when David was at work and Emily was out on one of her mysterious errands, Ethan sneaked into her room once again. His heart pounded as he opened her laptop, hoping the password he'd used before would still work. To his relief, it did, and he was in. Quickly, he opened the folder labeled Insurance Policy. This time he read through it carefully, taking in the legal terms that outlined the payout in the event of an accidental death. His stomach churned as he realized that Emily planned to make his father's death look like an accident, claiming millions in insurance money and vanishing with Mark. In another folder labeled Mark, Ethan found even more damning evidence, messages between Emily and her accomplice. Their words painted a chilling picture of their plans, talking about next steps and the payout with casual disregard for the life they were about to destroy. They mentioned hotels, airline tickets, and even a new life abroad. Everything was mapped out, from the marriage to the supposed accident they'd arranged for his father. Ethan took screenshots of everything. saving the files onto a USB drive he'd brought with him. He knew that if he could just show this to his father, there would be no way David could deny it. But he had to be careful. If Emily caught him, he didn't want to think about what she might do. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly closed the laptop, stowing the USB drive in his pocket. He barely managed to slip out of her room before Emily walked through the door. "Ethan?" she called, her voice echoing through the hall. He quickly stepped into the kitchen, trying to appear as though he was just grabbing a snack. "I'm here," he called back, doing his best to keep his voice steady. Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What were you doing just now?" Ethan forced a shrug. "I was just looking for a snack." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze icy and calculating. He felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a hawk, every muscle tense as he waited for her to look away. Finally, she seemed to relax, giving him one of her forced smiles. "Well, try not to make a mess," she said, turning to put away her purse. Ethan let out a silent breath of relief, but he knew he couldn't relax. He clutched the USB drive in his pocket, feeling the weight of the evidence against her, knowing he had to find the perfect moment to show it to his father. In the days that followed, Ethan's nerves were stretched thin. He became increasingly paranoid, constantly checking that the USB drive was hidden and untouched. Each time he heard Emily on the phone with Mark, each time she mentioned the insurance or Phase 2, his determination grew. But as the wedding day drew closer, he realized he was running out of time. He'd tried everything, attempts to talk to his father, secret investigations, even gathering evidence. Yet, he was no closer to stopping Emily's plan. It was as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, watching his father walk toward disaster, unable to do anything to save him. Then, the night before the wedding, Ethan made up his mind. He would confront Emily at the ceremony in front of everyone. If his father wouldn't listen to him alone, maybe, just maybe, the truth, revealed in front of everyone, would force him to see who Emily truly was. As Ethan drifted into a restless sleep, he pictured the scene in his mind. Standing in the chapel, facing Emily with the USB drive in his pocket, the congregation gasping as he revealed her lies. He knew he couldn't back down. This was his last chance to save his father. In his dreams, he saw himself standing at the altar, shouting out, "Stop the wedding!" The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the sun casting a warm glow across the small chapel. Friends and family gathered, filling the seats as soft music played in the background. David stood at the altar, a look of pure joy lighting up his face, dressed in a crisp black tuxedo that complemented his bright, hopeful smile. For him, today marked the beginning of a beautiful new life, the chance for a fresh start after years of grief and loneliness. Ethan, however, felt the complete opposite. His stomach churned with anxiety as he clutched the ring pillow in his hands, his small knuckles turning white from the tight grip. He glanced up at his father, who caught his eye and gave him an encouraging smile, completely unaware of the storm raging inside his son. Ethan managed a weak smile in return, but he felt a rising panic that only he seemed to feel. The first notes of the wedding march filled the air, and the congregation rose, all eyes fixed on the doors at the back of the chapel. Ethan's gaze, however, stayed on his father, his heart pounding with dread. He knew he had only moments to make his move, yet fear held him back. The enormity of what he was about to do weighed on him heavily, but he knew that if he didn't act now, he might never have another chance. The chapel doors swung open, and there stood Emily, radiant in a flowing white dress, her golden hair cascading down her shoulders. She wore a smile that seemed warm and genuine, but Ethan knew better. Behind that mask of beauty was a heart filled with cold ambition, a woman willing to destroy his father's life for the sake of money. As she walked slowly down the aisle, her gaze briefly met Ethan's, and he caught a flicker of something dark in her eyes. A warning, a reminder that she knew he was on to her. But instead of making him shrink back, it only fueled his determination. His father's life was at stake, and he couldn't allow fear to paralyze him any longer. When she reached the altar, David took her hand, beaming with pride and love. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the chapel. Each word that passed felt like another tick on a countdown clock. Ethan's pulse raced as he clutched the USB drive hidden in his pocket, the proof of her lies and her plans to destroy his father. "Speak now, or forever hold your peace." The words hung in the air, and Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. This was his moment. He felt his whole body tense, and then, before he could second-guess himself, he shouted, "Wait, stop the wedding!" Gasps rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned toward Ethan. David's face transformed from surprise to concern as he looked down at his son, bewildered. "Ethan, what's going on?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "Dad, you can't marry her. She's not who you think she is." His voice wavered, but he took a steadying breath, locking eyes with Emily, who stared at him with a mixture of shock and barely concealed fury. David knelt down beside Ethan, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" The congregation murmured, their eyes darting between David, Emily, and Ethan. Emily forced a smile, though her voice was laced with irritation. "Sweetie, I know this is a big change for you, but we're going to be a family. It's natural to feel scared." Ethan took a shaky breath, standing his ground. "No, that's not it. I heard you, Emily. I heard you on the phone with Mark, and I know about the insurance policy. You're planning to hurt Dad." A hush fell over the chapel as the guests looked on, shocked and confused. David's face paled, his eyes widening as he tried to process what his son was saying. "Ethan, this is a serious accusation. Are you sure?" "Yes," Ethan cried, pulling the USB drive from his pocket and holding it out to his father. "I found this on her computer. She's been lying to you, Dad. She's planning to kill you for money." Emily's laugh rang out, high-pitched and brittle. "This is absurd. David, he's just a child. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Mark is the wedding planner. That's why I was discussing the insurance policy with him, to make sure everything was covered for the ceremony." Ethan shook his head furiously. "No, Dad, that's not true. She's lying. I saw photos of her with Mark. They're not just wedding planners." David looked between Ethan and Emily, his face etched with confusion and hurt. "Ethan, these are very serious things you're saying. Are you absolutely certain?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. "I wouldn't lie to you, Dad. I heard her talking about how they'd take the money and leave. And she's been mean to me. Dad, she's been hurting me when you're not around." Emily's face contorted with anger. "This is a temper tantrum. David, we've talked about this. Ethan doesn't like change. He's just trying to drive a wedge between us because he can't accept someone new in your life." But David's eyes had hardened, his trust visibly shaken. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice low, "is there any truth to this? Any at all?" For a moment, Emily's facade cracked, her eyes darting around the chapel, taking in the shocked faces of the guests, the stern look on the officiant's face, and Ethan's tear-streaked face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Then her expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Ethan with raw contempt. "You spoiled brat," she spat, forgetting herself in her fury. "You have no idea what you've just ruined." A collective gasp echoed through the chapel, and David's face twisted with disbelief and betrayal. In that moment, he saw her for who she really was, the mask she'd worn shattering completely. "Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with hurt and confusion. "What have you done?" Emily's demeanor shifted as she backpedaled, forcing a strained smile. "David, I was stressed. I've just been under so much pressure, and Ethan has been so difficult." But David took a step back, his face hardening. "No, Emily. I need the truth. If there's even a shred of honesty left in you, I need you to tell me everything." Her eyes darted toward the exit, and for a split second she looked like a cornered animal. Then, with a scowl, she turned on her heel and bolted down the aisle, her dress billowing behind her as she shoved past stunned guests. "Someone stop her," David called, his voice breaking. He glanced down at Ethan, his expression a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "You were right, buddy. I'm so sorry." David pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, tears welling in his eyes as he held his son close. For a brief moment, the chaos around them faded, and it was just the two of them, bound by the truth that had finally come to light. The police arrived minutes later, called by one of the guests. As they took statements from the wedding party and the stunned attendees, David held on to Ethan, his face etched with disbelief. He couldn't fathom how close he had come to disaster, how easily he had trusted someone who had nearly destroyed their lives. One of the officers approached them, her expression serious but gentle. "Mr. Matthews, we'll need both you and your son to come down to the station. We need to take statements and gather any evidence." David nodded, giving Ethan a reassuring squeeze. "Of course, whatever you need." As they prepared to leave the chapel, David glanced around at the friends and family members who had come to celebrate what was supposed to be the start of a new chapter in his life. Instead, it had become a moment of painful reckoning, a reminder of the blind spots love could create. But in the midst of that pain was a glimmer of hope. His son's love and bravery had saved him from a fate he couldn't have foreseen. The ride to the police station was surreal. David sat beside Ethan in the back of the police car, holding his son's hand tightly. He was filled with a mix of grief, relief, and pride. For months, he had been blind to the truth, yet Ethan had seen through the lies and risked everything to protect him. As they pulled into the station, David turned to Ethan, his voice soft but firm. "You saved me, son. I'll never doubt you again." Ethan looked up, his face filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "I just didn't want to lose you, Dad." David smiled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "And thanks to you, you didn't." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of questions and statements. Ethan sat beside his father in a small, plain room at the police station, a sense of quiet exhaustion settling over him. David held his son's hand tightly, as though anchoring himself after everything that had just happened. As they recounted the events, David's face grew increasingly pale, his trust in Emily disintegrating with each detail Ethan provided. The police officers listened intently as Ethan described Emily's behavior, the overheard phone calls, and the disturbing discoveries on her laptop. When he handed over the USB drive containing the insurance documents and incriminating photos, the officers exchanged grim looks. It was clear to them that Emily's intentions had been far darker than anyone could have anticipated. After hours of questioning, Officer Johnson, who had been taking notes throughout the interview, nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Ethan. You've been incredibly brave, and I have no doubt you saved your father's life." Ethan glanced at David, who managed a grateful but weary smile. "I'm proud of you, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just wish I'd listened to you sooner." David pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, and for a brief moment, the sterile walls of the police station faded away. They were just father and son, bound by the love and trust that had ultimately saved them both. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Officer Rivera, who walked in with an update. "Mr. Matthews, we have officers searching for Emily. She fled the scene, but we've issued an alert to all local and state agencies. Rest assured, we'll do everything we can to bring her in." David nodded, his face etched with a mix of grief and resolve. "Thank you, officer. I don't know how I missed all of this." Officer Johnson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "These kinds of people are incredibly skilled at hiding their intentions. What's important is that she didn't succeed." As they were about to leave, Officer Rivera's radio crackled to life. "Suspect sighted near the train station," a voice reported. "She's attempting to leave the area." David felt a pang of fear but then looked down at Ethan, whose brave face steadied him. He knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. After hours of waiting, they finally received word. Emily had evaded capture and vanished without a trace. She'd managed to slip away, leaving behind a trail of chaos and shattered trust. The news left David reeling, and a somber silence settled between him and Ethan as they made their way home. In the days that followed, David threw himself into the work of rebuilding their lives, trying to shield Ethan from the overwhelming media attention that the story had attracted. Friends, family members, and even distant acquaintances bombarded them with calls, expressing shock and disbelief over the events. David tried to protect Ethan from the onslaught, but the attention was inescapable. One evening, David found himself alone with his thoughts, the reality of what they'd escaped hitting him hard. How could he have been so blind? The guilt weighed on him heavily, but every time he looked at Ethan, he was reminded of his son's bravery, his determination to protect him at all costs. Over the next few weeks, David and Ethan slowly found a rhythm again. They resumed their usual routines: school, work, and quiet dinners together. Though Emily's presence lingered like a shadow, They began to move forward. David set up new security measures around the house, adding cameras and alarms, doing everything in his power to ensure they would be safe. One evening, as David tucked Ethan into bed, his son looked up at him with a worried expression. "Dad, do you think she'll come back?" David hesitated, unsure how to answer. He wanted to reassure Ethan, but he also knew he couldn't make promises he wasn't certain he could keep. Finally, he settled on honesty. "I don't know, buddy, but we're prepared, and we have people looking out for us, and no matter what, I'll always protect you." Ethan nodded, visibly comforted by his father's words. He reached out, wrapping his arms around David's neck in a fierce hug. "I love you, Dad." David felt a wave of emotion wash over him as he hugged his son back. "I love you too, Ethan, more than anything." In the following weeks, life began to settle back into something resembling normalcy. David resumed his work with a new sense of purpose, determined to be there for Ethan in a way he hadn't been before. Ethan, in turn, threw himself into his studies, finding comfort in the familiar routine of school and friendships. The shadow of Emily's betrayal still lingered, but they were learning to live with it, finding strength in each other and the bond that had carried them through the darkest days. Then, one crisp autumn morning, there was a knock at their door. David's heart skipped a beat as he opened it to find Officer Johnson standing there, his expression grave. "Mr. Matthews, I have some news. We found Emily." David felt a surge of relief, but quickly tempered it with caution. "Did you arrest her?" Officer Johnson shook his head. "No, sir. We found her body in a motel just outside of Las Vegas. It appears she took her own life." The news hit David like a punch to the gut. He stumbled back, steadying himself against the doorframe as he processed the information. "She's gone?" "Yes, sir," Officer Johnson confirmed. "She left a note, but we're still trying to piece together her final movements. She'd been on the run for weeks, constantly moving from place to place." At that moment, Ethan came into the room, his eyes widening as he saw the officer. "Dad? What's happening?" David looked down at his son, his face a mixture of sadness and relief. He knelt down to Ethan's level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Buddy, they found Emily. She won't be coming back." Ethan's eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, and he nodded slowly. "Are we safe now?" David pulled him into a tight embrace. "Yes, Ethan, we're safe now." As Officer Johnson left, promising to keep them informed of any further details, David and Ethan sat together in the quiet living room, both lost in thought. The news brought a sense of closure, but it also stirred up complex emotions they would need time to process. Emily's actions had left scars, but they were finally free from her shadow. In the days that followed, David and Ethan attended counseling together, working through their feelings and finding ways to heal. They leaned on each other, their bond stronger than ever, both determined to move forward with a renewed sense of hope. 6 months later, on the anniversary of what was supposed to be David and Emily's wedding day, David decided to start a new tradition. He and Ethan packed a picnic and drove to a nearby state park, spending the day hiking, fishing, and simply enjoying each other's company. As they sat by a sparkling lake, watching the sun set over the water, David turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You know, buddy, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "And as terrible as it was, I learned something important from it." Ethan looked up at him, curious. "What's that, Dad?" David smiled, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "I learned that the most important relationship in my life is right here." He gently poked Ethan's chest. "You and me, we're a team, and nothing's ever going to change that." Ethan beamed, throwing his arms around his father in a tight hug. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, kiddo," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." As they packed up their picnic and headed home, a sense of peace settled over them. They had weathered a storm that had nearly torn them apart, but they had come out stronger, united by the love that had saved them both. The story of a brave boy who had saved his father from an unimaginable betrayal became a reminder to their community of the power of courage and love. And as David and Ethan drove home under the soft glow of the setting sun, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by an unbreakable bond that nothing and no one could ever sever. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.